Ray Robinson would spar with middleweights in Grubb's gym. And he would run out of sparring partners because he was only a lightweight. And lightweights wouldn't get in the ring with him. Few welterweights tried, but he had to spar with much bigger men, and he was knocking those men out. And in 38, Coco Kid had watched him knock out 3 men in that gymnasium because he was in town for a fight that he had himself. Those 2 men were supposed to spar, and Coco Kid already had an established career. At this point, he was a colored welterweight champion. He would lose it to Charlie Burley. Coco Kid would be the first established colored welterweight champion when he would defeat young Peter Jackson. And he would be the last colored middleweight champion when he would defeat Holman Williams. So Ray Robinson would turn professional on the undercard of Fitzy Zivic and Henry Armstrong. The problem that Harry Wiley Sr. would have, he wanted the attention of Ray Robinson, and he wanted him to be on the same bill as a main event fighter. George Gangford didn't want that because he wanted to make sure that he can get as much money through Ray Robinson as possible. But it worked out because Henry Armstrong would lose his championship title to Fitzy Zivic. But those who most remembered was the victory of a young up-and-coming, dazzling Harlem fighter, who was also known as the Harlem Jitterbug. His name was Ray Robinson. The majority of the fight fans didn't necessarily come to see Henry Armstrong and Fitzy Zivic. They wanted to see Ray Robinson. And Curtis Anderson and myself used to talk about this all the time. And when Curtis and I spoke on the telephone, we talked about the moves, the short uppercuts and short hooks, the balance control, how Ray Robinson would look up and punch down. He would look sideways, and he would hook off the jab. He would feint you into a position where you had no choice but to cover up, go into defense mode. He would shoot a straight left jab to the pit of the stomach and come up with an overhand right. He would do this repeatedly, and he would get that skill from a man by the name of George Dixon, because Dixon had to fight in the zone, in the center of the ring. In 1892, Carnival of Champions, he was hit with sticks and bats every time he came to the side of the ropes because the white establishment didn't want sweat from a black fighter to fly on them. So they kept him in the middle of the ring. But he became a zone fighter. And that was taught to Ray Robinson by Harry Wiley Sr. It was Harry Smith, before he passed away in 1933. He kept popping the legs of Ray Robinson, who was Smitty at the time, when he kept moving around too much on that heavy bag. He kept him in the zone, right in the front of the bag, but side-to-side movement, and kept him turning around the bag from left and turning around the bag from right and shooting to the pit of the stomach because you hit a man under the heart, it is hard for him to breathe and it hurts when he breathes. You hit him in the doramius muscle. You hit him in the mandibular, the breadbasket, and the floating rib. But you make a combination out of that. One of the men that Ray Robinson learned that from was a colored middleweight champion by the name of Holman Williams. Joe Louis and Ray Robinson got moves from Holman Williams because he was an outstanding fighter. I have him ranked number 1 of My Black Murderers Row. List of fighters. And when Ray would jab and move and stick, it was a thing of beauty. 1941, he would take on Sammy Ingot. 1942, he would take on a fighter by the name who was actually a champion at this point in time. His name was Marty Servo. And Sammy Ingot and Marty Servo didn't have their titles on the line. They didn't want to lose their titles to Ray Robinson. Sammy Ingot didn't make weight in Philadelphia, and he didn't make weight at New York's Madison Square Garden. And what happened with Ray Robinson, with Sammy Ingot, the New York SAC didn't recognize a 19-year-old to fight for their title. Ray Robinson was no longer 19, he was 20. So since that confusion came up, it was up to the champion to decide whether he allowed himself to be in that ring with that fighter or not. Sammy Ingot said, absolutely not. I'll fight him, but not for my title. So they fought in a weight of 136 pounds. In contingency that Sammy Ingot would give Ray Robinson a title shot once they got that mess straightened out. Sammy Ingot would decide to vacate his title. Marty Servo, as welterweight, when he defeated Freddie Red Cochrane, decided that he wouldn't challenge his title with Ray Robinson. So when Robinson moved up from a lightweight to welterweight, he had to wait 5 years for a crack at the title. Because in 42, he was hauled off to war. And there was an incident where Ray Robinson would wake up in Staten Island Hospital. It was said that he fell down the stairs and he couldn't remember what happened. That's controversy. Many thought Ray didn't want to be in the war. But then Ray Robinson would take on a fighter by the name of Artie Levine. He was out of Brooklyn. They fought in Cleveland. And Artie Levine would knock Ray Robinson out of the ring, or 20 count. Ray would make it back in 19 seconds. I spoke with Artie Levine, and he didn't seem bitter. He said Ray was the greatest, but you can hear in his voice that he felt jobbed. Artie Levine obviously later in life. But Ray would say that he was the hardest puncher that he has ever faced. Then Ray would take on Tommy Bell. This is all in 45. But in 46, Marty Servo was supposed to take on Ray Robinson. He didn't want to fight Ray Robinson because he lost to Ray Robinson twice before. And the top 6 were all white fighters. And they all refused to fight him. So the belt went up vacant. And the number 7 rank was a black fighter. His name was Tommy Bell. He's out of Ohio. He had a younger brother by the name of Bobby Bell. There was 3 brothers in the Bell family, but 2 of them were fighters. Bobby was a bantamweight and Tommy Bell was a welterweight. Tommy Bell was in there with Jake LaMotta, many of them. But Ray would take him on December 20th, 1946, in New York's Madison Square Garden. And my grandfather was in the arena that night. And you had to sit at that time at the top tier. All black fight fans had to be at the top of the tier. And he watched Ray Robinson get dropped in the 6th round. Oh my God. When Ray went down, everybody got up. And he was on one knee, shaking his head. And you can hear the tiptoe of Tommy Bell going back to his corner, hands raised. And you can see the sweat flying from the conch hair, wavy conch hair, that was processed by Ray Robinson. And you didn't know whether or not Ray would make it, but Ray would get up. And everyone held their breath. And when Ray got up, he did the most beautiful ballerina dance around that ring. All you heard was footsteps. And you could see his head rotating from side to side, almost as though he was shadow boxing. Both fists flying. Left hand moved up, right hand moved down. He popped the jab. He tied his man up, walked him back to the middle of the ring. He would hook off the jab, tie him up, and do it all over again until he completely cleared his head. And when he did, one of the most beautiful boxing exhibitions you would ever find. And Curtis Anderson and myself talk about that fight. And when Ray became the welterweight champion of the world, he became the 5th black fighter to win that crown. Joe Walcott would win it in 1902. Dixie Kid would win it in 1904. Young Jack Thompson would win it from a fighter by the name of Jackie Fields. I knew Jackie Fields. He was something else. He would win it from Jackie Fields. Then you had Henry Armstrong, who would win that title 1938, New York's Madison Square Garden Bowl, from Barney Ross. Then the 5th fighter in the black community that would win that crown and wear it proudly would be Curtis Anderson's favorite fighter, Sugar Ray Robinson. And Robinson would have a premonition in his first title defense that he would kill a man in the ring. That young man's name was Jimmy Doyle. And he was waking up in cold sweats, and he wanted to speak to a Catholic priest and a minister, his trainer. He said he couldn't fight that night. And they all said, "No, Ray, it's just a dream. Go ahead and put the fight." Because Ray said that he dreamt that he hit a man with a left hook and he died in the ring. Because Ray was training in Pumpkin Lakes and he knocked a man out cold. 3 men that same training camp. But he knocked a man out cold. Man didn't get up. Eventually he did. But he saw himself doing that to Jimmy Doyle. And they said no, because they all had money on Ray Robinson. The Catholic priests, the ministers, every last one of them. And they told him to go ahead with the fight. So Ray went on with the fight, and he wound up knocking out Jimmy Doyle with a left hook, and he killed him. And Ray's last welterweight title defense was against a fighter by the name of Charlie Fusari. He was fought out of New Jersey. And the referee there at that time was Paul Cavalier. He was a trainer of mine in Lenny Shaw's boxing gym. He told me that story. And you can see that fight film. I have it myself. It's on YouTube. You can see the beauty of both men. Because Charlie Fusari was an outstanding fighter. Robinson would defend his title for the last time. And he would move up and want to take on Jake LaMotta. Now, what happened with Ray Robinson? He fought Jake LaMotta in 1942. He defeated him. And in 43, he lost to him after his 40th fight. 2 weeks later, he would take on California Jackie Wilson, defeat him. Then a week after that, he would take on Jake LaMotta once again. This would be 3 weeks after his first fight with LaMotta. And he would defeat LaMotta, go out for a 20 count and get back in the ring. But he would become victorious. Then he would fight again in 45. 1951. He would fight Ray Robinson, would take on Jake LaMotta once again. Now here's the thing with Jake LaMotta. Jake LaMotta was supposed to fight Ray Robinson. But he took on a fighter who he almost lost to. 13 seconds. And the money was being shifted around because they didn't know one way or the other, because Jake LaMotta didn't want to take a dive in 1947 against Blackjack Billy Fox out of Philadelphia. And he was offered $1,000 from the Philadelphia crime family. And Jake didn't want to take the dive. But his brother was in trouble, Joey LaMotta, so he decided to take the dive. But he didn't take the $100,000. He was offered $20,000 at the last minute. He took the $20,000. He betted on himself when he fought Marcel Sedan. Marcel Sedan did not answer the 10th round, claimed he had an injured shoulder. So Jake LaMotta would double his earnings. And when Marcel Sedan would fly back to this country from Casablanca, his plane crashed because Ray Robinson was signed to fight Jake LaMotta. And allegedly, Marcel Sedan was not going to take a step aside. So to make a long story short, Ray Robinson would wind up getting that fight with Jake LaMotta. It was February 14th, 1951. Now here's the interesting thing. Ray Robinson, along with Ezzy Charles, another great fighter and a favorite fighter of Curtis Anderson, Willie Pep, Ike Williams, you had a man by the name of Cleo Shane, Jimmy Bivens. They all turned professional in 1940. All of them came from those Chicago Golden Gloves. All of them. And those are the greatest fighters in history, and they all turned professional together. And guess what? They all lost their title in 1951. They turned professional in 1940, and they lost their crown in 51. But Ray Robinson would be the only fighter who would regain his title in 51. And that would be against Randy Turpin of England. So when Curtis Anderson and I have conversations, my number one fighter is Sam Langford, his is Ray Robinson. And we would talk for hours about the difference between the two men. And I always told Curtis, you have to understand something. You have to look at the time in which the man came. Because that dictates how he moves. That dictates what opportunity he gets. That dictates how he decides to go on about his career. Sam Langford was a 5-time colored heavyweight champion, 1-time colored middleweight champion, 1-time European middleweight champion. He was an Australian and Mexican heavyweight champion. He was also a black champion, separate title. He fought Harry Wills 22 times. Harry Wills was about 7 inches taller than he was. He fought Battling Jim Johnson 15 times. He fought Sam McVeigh 5 times. He was in the ring with Joe Jeanette plenty of times. He fought every fighter you can think of. Ray Robinson fought some really good fighters. He dominated all of them. He fought Jake LaMotta 6 times, defeated him 5 times, and lost to him once. He split victories with Randy Turpin. But Ray showed his heart. New York Polo Grounds. He was about to lose for the 2nd time to Randy Turpin. He had a laceration over his right eye. Ruby Goldstein told me this personally. He lived on Cherry Street in the same senior development, if you will, with a friend of mine named Teddy, and he told me this personally. I went to Teddy's house, and Ruby Goldstein was sitting on the couch. Teddy asked me, "Do you know who this man is?" I couldn't make him out at the time, but I come to learn that he was Ruby Goldstein. I knew who Ruby Goldstein was, but I couldn't pick it up at that time. I was a young man, and I was sitting on the opposite couch of Ruby Goldstein. And he was telling me about the story the 2 stories he shared with me, with Amro Griffith and Benny Kid Barrett, and Ray Robinson and Randy Turpin. He also shared the story with Joe Louis and Joe Walcott, their first fight, and many other stories. But those are the ones that stuck out to me the most. And I share those stories with Curtis, and Curtis would share stories with me. But at the end of the day, Ray Robinson was the perfect fighting machine. He was coined pound for pound. Pound for pound would mean, how would a smaller man do against a heavier man? In the case of Robinson and Joe Louis, they were coining fighters like Benny Leonard and others, but Ray Robinson was the main fighter who they coined that from. Why? Because pound for pound initially means that you do everything at top form. He shadowboxed the best. He threw his left hand, right hand. He could punch. He could take a punch. He had stamina. He had heart. He had resiliency. He was one of the greatest negotiators. He understood the game. He was pound for pound. Libre brought libre, the best. And for that reason, Curtis Anderson has embraced him. And for that reason, I talk about him today. I love Sugar Ray Robinson, everything he stood for. And I agree, Curtis Anderson, that Ray Robinson was the greatest pound for pound fighter of all times. I have Sam Langford has the best career of any fighter in boxing history. And that is an absolute fact. But Ray Robinson was pound for pound. And I just wanted to acknowledge my brother, Curtis Anderson. I wanted to acknowledge my brother, Curtis Anderson, in this conversation, his favorite fighter. That's chapter 3. I read those chapters to you in conversation because Curtis wasn't feeling well for many months. And Curtis would tell you if he asked him, don't shed a tear for me, because I am no longer in pain, no longer in agony, no longer stripped or raped of my dignity. No longer do I have to succumb to others who want to pamper me. No longer will I have to accept anything from anyone because I don't have the physical capabilities of doing so. I've lived a great life. My job now is to make sure others are good. And he would call me all the time and ask me how I'm doing. And he'd be upset if I climbed the ladder because I have back injuries. And he would talk to his other brother, Stormy B. Man. And he would be concerned about him. I'd be on the phone with Curtis. Curtis would be on the phone with Trick Nolte. And I don't know he's on the phone with Trick Nolte because he asked Trick Nolte to hold on. And he'll talk to me and he'll forget that he's on the phone with me when he says, hold on, scrap. And I'm holding on and he forgets he's on and he's all over the place. And I felt bad for Curtis because Curtis has stretched himself to everybody. And he just wanted to please everybody. And Curtis would share his knowledge from the hospital bed. He'd be on Blue Blood. He'd be on The Three Wise Men. He'd be on other various chats while he was on dialysis, while he was in the hospital bed. Many never knew that. And he would be coughing and he would be weak. But because he was who he was, that's what made him special. And Curtis, if he can talk to you today, he would tell you, live your life as though you were writing a book. Because once you come here and your story is told amongst family members and friends and those who you're meeting for the very first time, you want your book to be the best damn seller in the cemetery. Live your life, live your life, live your life. One love. Shout out to my brother, Curtis Sanders. Much love, brother. Peace.